Hey everybody, I'm Pastor AJ Houseman and welcome to 10 Foot Pole, a podcast to dig deeper into aspects of the Bible that get glossed over or totally ignored in most preaching. The Bible has a lot of parts that are racy, uncomfortable, and sometimes downright horrifying. Let's talk about it. Welcome to Season 4, Episode 21. We're in our second week of our Revelation study. Today we're going to talk about the dragon and the pregnant lady. And our special guest joining us this week to have this conversation is Pastor Chris Schaefer, who is the pastor at Divinity Lutheran Church in Towson, Maryland.
Hello, gentle listeners. Yes.
It's so delighted to have you.
It's always a delight to be here. Let me just say you have been crushing it. I have been so delighted and so honored to be asked back again, particularly amongst the caliber of tremendous guests that you've had recently, some of whom I am blessed to know. So always good to be back with you.
Well, it's always, your conversations are some of my absolute favorites, so I'm really grateful for you here. And Pastor Chris just did a whole extended study on the book of Revelation. So he is now our expert.
That's a dangerous qualifier there.
So as we were talking about kind of before we started recording, right, that Revelation is a book that many people haven't spent a lot of time diving into and can very easily get misinterpreted, which we talked about last week with Dr. Lewis. And so Chris said that he has developed a whole new appreciation for this book after doing this extended study.
Oh, I had not spent that much time with it either, and I had kind of picked up bits and pieces of it, but it doesn't really show up in the lectionary that we discuss a lot, and so it's something that I haven't spent as much time with recently, and most of what I knew about it came from pop culture references, which, as I have since found, are wildly inaccurate most of the time, and comes with the same danger as you generally have when you are kind of cherry picking verses and things out of context within Scripture. And so I think to look at it as a whole has just given me a whole new perspective and appreciation for not only how it probably would have been received in its original context, but also how it still kind of speaks to universal truths that are still relevant to us today, too.
So I kind of blame the lectionary. So there are gifts and curses of the Revised Common Lectionary.
Amen.
A gift is never having to try very hard to come up with the topic, right? The lectionary tells you what you're going to talk about.
Yep.
And when, as a pastor, you're doing 10,000 other things during the week, it's really nice to just this is what you should be
someone
talking
else,
about this
someone else make the choice, please.
Oh, yeah, exactly. But one of the downsides, right, is there's a lot of pieces of the Bible then that we don't focus on, both that never get read in corporate worship, but also that honestly, as pastors, because it's never coming up in our corporate worship, right? We don't spend very much time with it.
Exactly. Yeah.
You may spend a couple of days on it in seminary and then you move on because it's
never
going to come up again.
Yep.
Which is, can be a bit of a downside, I think.
Truth.
It's also why we focus so much on Jesus, because we get to listen to Jesus every week, but only, other parts of the Bible every 3 years.
Well, and as it turns out, he figures rather prominently in Revelation. So, so even though Luther certainly had some mixed views on Revelation and wasn't always convinced it was of the Holy Spirit, I have since come to see, again, Jesus in a new light after seeing all of this too. So,
yeah. Well, we're going to dive in here today into chapter 12. So last week we went through an introduction, and so we're skipping quite a few chapters. And that's purely for the sake of time, right? In 5 weeks, we don't have time to cover all of it. So I very specifically picked out the super awkward and uncomfortable and crazy parts of the book, because that's just the kind of podcast that I run. So why would we not talk about those things?
Absolutely.
So we're going to dive into Revelation chapter 12. I'm not going to read the entire chapter. I'm going to read verses 1 through 9. and then 13 through 17, which gives us this general overview of the fun story about this dragon. Um, the dragon and the pregnant lady uh,
Hmm.
is a good one. So,
Yeah, always. Yeah. Classic title.
all right. And I'm going to read the New Revised Standard Version, updated edition, which I just learned in this upcoming year is what all of Sundays and Seasons is officially transferring over to.
It's truth. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. We're
yeah,
moving on up. Yeah.
good. I'm very happy when that came out, and then like
Agreed.
nothing happened. I was like, are we not
Yeah.
doing it?
Yeah.
We are.
No, there's some good updates in there.
We're
Let's,
just slow. Okay.
yeah.
A great portent also gets translated as wonder or sign. A great sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed the sun with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pangs, in the agony of giving birth. Then another portent, or sign, appeared in heaven, a great red dragon, with 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems on its heads. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. Then the dragon stood before the woman who was about to deliver her child, so that he might devour her child as soon as it was born. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with the scepter of iron. But her child was snatched away and taken to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, so that there she can be nourished for 1,260 days. A war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. The dragon and his angels fought back, but they were defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. So when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the women who had delivered the male child. But the woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle so that she could fly from the serpent into the wilderness, to her place where she is nourished for a time and a half time. Then from his mouth the serpent poured water like a river after the woman to sweep her away with the flood. But the earth came to the help of the woman and opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from his mouth. Then the dragon was angry with the woman and went off to wage war on the rest of her children, those who kept the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Ah. So there's a lot going on here.
Minus, yeah.
But just a thing that we need to like remember as we hold this story is that this is a vision,
Hmm.
or that it's not necessarily like a thing that happened. It is a vision, so it's full of a whole bunch of symbolism, all of which would have been very evident to the original audience, right? Like so many references to Daniel and to the
Hmm.
Exodus and to the flood, and even some Isaiah of this idea of this coming of the Lord into the world. So there's a lot to unpack, but that it is indeed like a vision that he is giving
Yeah.
them. So it's meant to be symbolic, all the way down to like the number of days that she was in the
Oh,
wilderness.
everywhere, right? I mean, so
Mhm.
the Hebrew scriptures are all over this text, and kind of sacred numerology, so to speak, right? But they all kind of have significance and meaning. So and I think it's one of the blessings and challenges of a book like Revelation is that, well, first, my standard kind of coming out is just to make sure that we know that it's only one revelation.
Yes.
It's a really long one. It seems like there's multiple revelations, but just one. I can always kind of tell in movies who's done their homework.
Hmm.
Um,
I do the same thing. Like if it's in a show or a movie or something and they say
yep,
Revelations, I like scream at my
yep,
TV.
yep. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Sometimes there are
Revelation.
things. Yeah, yeah, just one, just one.
Um, So, some of the basic symbolism here with the people, right? So, the woman often gets, the figuratism for it could be Israel, or it could be the church, or as the Roman Catholic Church often portrays as Mary.
Yep.
Which is why if you see a lot of like portraits and paintings and stuff of Mary in the Roman Catholic setting, they usually have this like crown with the 12 stars on it, which is a
Yes.
reference to here.
Yep. Yeah, I actually have a sticker on the cover of my laptop that you obviously can't see, of Mary striking down a serpent, and it kind of has some cultural references to how Mary is often presented in Central America, and Northern South America. And so, yeah, I mean, pretty much anytime you get pregnant woman, right, who's going to be giving birth to somebody who's going to be ruling over the nations,
Hmm.
automatically from a Christian perspective, like we often jump to Mary, but I think there's far more symbolism there. I think you can also connect her to Eve, who experiences pain in birth as kind of a consequence for eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and I also find connections with Hagar
Mm.
and Ishmael, particularly because this is a pregnant woman who is sent out into the wilderness essentially. But in Hagar's case, right, that was more of a punishment that from a very jealous enslaver, I guess, if we want to categorize her as such.
Right, but also God does promise to protect them in the wilderness
Correct,
as
right?
well.
And so there's protection in the wilderness. And I think another way that you can connect to Israel, right? Again, you have after their exodus from Egypt, essentially, this is almost like a birth pang in a
Hmm.
way. And they are then sent out into the wilderness. But again, God meets them in the wilderness. Oftentimes, wilderness is this place that it's wild and chaos. Presumably, the purview of any forces of chaos that are against God, i.e., a chaos serpent, a dragon. And so in each of these instances, though, God shows up, even in the
Hmm.
areas where we not necessarily think God is going to show up, and God takes care.
Yeah.
I find connections also to Psalm 55, which is one of my faves, and in that. So do you remember in Forrest Gump when Jenny is trying to escape her abusive father and goes out into the field with Forrest, and she says, "Please God, make me a bird so I can fly far, far away."
Yeah.
That comes from Psalm 55,
Hmm.
and there's
Look
this
that up.
whole thing in the beginning of it where it says, if only I had wings like a dove, I could fly away into the wilderness and there find lodging and rest and safety because they're trying to get away from this abusive situation that they had with somebody who was a contemporary of theirs. And different than eagle's wings, though, right? Which she eventually gets in this passage, which again is also very significant. Eagles are often used as a symbol of divine presence and particularly divine judgment. And so much so that they were kind of one of the animals that was connected with one of the tribes of Israel. Um, and it referenced a couple times throughout scripture, but also ends up being the Roman Empire's symbol that they kind of take over and twist to make because they think that they are divine authority and judgment incarnate on earth, but in here she is raised up on eagle's
I
wings.
was trying so hard not to have that playing in my head so
I'm
I could just
sorry. I'm
hear it.
sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, but you can't escape it,
Hmm.
truly. I don't think. Anyway, all this to say, I think that there are so many different ways that we could kind of understand this pregnant woman and her child, and that, as I think is true in most, if not all, of Revelation, there's not necessarily just one right answer,
Hmm.
right? That there could be multiple truths, multiple answers that maybe
Yeah.
they each contain a little truth, but a lot of it just depends on. what who is reading it and who, their worldview, what their perspective is, they're naturally going to make some associations. There was a popular story in Roman culture about Leto and the Python. Um, that most of the readers of the Revelation, when it was first being written and distributed, would have probably been like, "Oh, this sounds like Leto," because Leto gets impregnated by Zeus, as many women were wont to do.
Hmm.
Zeus had that sort of track record, and she's pursued by this beast, this python, and she ends up kind of having getting pulled out to this island in the Aegean, where she finally gives birth to the god Apollo. And 4 days after he's born, Apollo goes out and chases down and kills the python in revenge for the python chasing his mom and making her go into exile on an island. And so automatically, when you have this woman who is clothed with the sun, right? And then you're
Hmm.
going to Apollo, god of sun, right? I mean,
Yeah.
they were probably going to make those associations naturally too.
Well, and do you know like which came first? It probably would have been the
Oh, Leto and the Python?
yeah.
Yeah, that came first. It was kind of like a fairy tale, I guess, if you want to say. But again, like most tales that were kind of mythological, they were not necessarily, completely made up, but were maybe perhaps based on some part of history or some part of understanding, or there's some sort of moral lesson or truth that's included in it. And so those were frequently adopted by other writers or storytellers. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
And this is a place of contention between some more, definitely on the conservative evangelical, a more biblical literist side,
Mhm.
than what I would say is a more, on the Lutherans kind of fall into the other side where we take the biblical scholarship and stuff like that into consideration, right? That they
Yeah.
have huge issues
Mm.
with trying to say that that these biblical writers were influenced by some of these other
Sure.
traditions and stories and histories, um, but the truth of the matter is that they were.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, I think all of us are kind of, in a way, at least influenced, whether directly or indirectly, by the context in which we exist, right? I
yeah,
mean, I think those, and a lot of times it's maybe not consciously done, or actively done, but it is something that just happens because we, are kind of sponges like that a lot of
yeah.
times. Yeah.
So some things with this in here, this idea of the ruling with the iron rod, that
Yeah.
this gets this sort of portrays, like if you read it in that English context, it portrays this idea that like Jesus is this powerful, terrifying Lord thing. But the Greek word there that we translate as rule in our thing is actually means to tend like a shepherd. And so that gives a very different like meaning and understanding of
Yeah.
this Christ figure is going to rule.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if we're, by the time that Revelation is written and distributed, most, if not all, of kind of the main Gospels, have been written and shared. And so it's something where Christ as shepherd image has already been established. And
Yeah.
so and certainly when we see Jesus already showing up in the first couple chapters of Revelation as this slain lamb, I think the everything has already been kind of thrown on its head in a way, right? Revelation is just a big fan of like, oh, it's a twist, right? Like just kind of being like, we got you. And so I think that to have someone who is both shepherd and sheep, in many ways is can seem like a contradiction, but. Not in the world of Jesus, and not
Hmm.
certainly not in the realm of apocryphal writing.
Hmm. But and it's a very just I think different. I just, to me, it changes the meaning so much of the way in which we expect Jesus to show up and to be this, this ruler, right? Is just very different based on that context. And so when we take that into context of the story and of this revelation of Christ, we're not getting this, you know, I can't even say like a mean or like this, like tyrant sort of
Yeah.
looking Christ, right? Like it's one of a
Yep.
shepherd,
Yeah.
which does also kind of bring us back to a little something we talked about last week, right? So this idea in John's original opening when he says, that he was, so grand, he had all these crowns, blah blah blah, but he still, reached down and was like, "Don't be afraid."
Yeah.
That there's this gentle tenderness
Yeah.
to how Jesus is, and even within these visions.
Absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of focus gets put on the kind of violence and destruction that happens throughout Revelation. But I mean, Revelation, I think, is just, it's a series. It's very cyclical, right? I mean,
Hmm.
you're going through six, seven cycles, depending on kind of how you look at it, I think. And so this section is kind of the beginning of Act Two, I guess, if you want to say. So we've already completed several cycles where there's just lots of violence and destruction, but in each of those cycles, there's a pause right before the final seal, trumpet, whatever the kind of format is of the cycle. There's a pause in which everything is kind of delayed a little bit. And the martyrs are up in heaven, kind of getting a little peeved, being like, "Did I die for nothing? What's taking you so long? Why isn't justice happening? I want vengeance, right?" And each time Jesus is like, "I'm doing this so that everybody has time to repent." I don't, my desire is not to destroy everyone and everything in this act of great wrath and vengeance, but the idea is this is kind of connecting it to the point of the plagues in Egypt. The point of it wasn't just to show how God, is really violent and awful, but I believe that the point is more so that throughout Revelation you get a series of warnings and promises.
Hmm.
And so the warning is, right, like there are consequences for your actions, whether that's the here and the now or, in some time to come. And the idea is not because God wants there to be destruction and death, but is trying to get people to understand. Again, this goes back to the very beginning in Genesis when you have knowledge of the good and evil kind of a thing. It's too much for you to handle, to be frank.
Hmm.
Right? You were never really, you weren't really designed to process all of that on your own. Certainly not equipped to decide. Right? But that when you have that understanding and you know that some things are wrong, there are consequences that you experience, whether they be natural and logical or otherwise. But the idea is, I don't want this to happen. I'm showing you what could happen in the future.
Yeah.
This is apocalyptic in a nutshell, right? Like I'm revealing this. I'm pulling back the curtain here. We're, in the center of the Wizard of Oz, and that green curtain's finally getting pulled back. We can kind of see what's happening here.
Hmm.
Um, the point is so that you can have a greater understanding, so that you can change your ways
Yeah.
because I actually desire life. I want all of you to be in this, new city or this new reality that is going to be coming.
Hmm. Yeah, and so there's two parts to this kind of story with the dragon, right? There's
Yeah.
this initial one of coming after the woman and the um, baby male child who
Hmm.
is to shepherd the people. And
Yeah.
then we skip to this, divine battle that
Yeah.
happens in heaven,
Yeah.
which just like leads to some interesting questions. And I have like a fun quote for this from one of my
Please.
commentaries that I really enjoyed. All of this must be said within the context of God's power and providence. Evil is never out of God's control, and the
Mm,
overcoming evil lies only in God's power. The
mm.
work of the Messiah is God's work, ending the reign of sin. But until that time comes, the power of evil had sway over all creation, including the creation that is in heaven.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting that we hear in this section that it's only at this point, presumably not yet. This is a vision of
Yeah.
what could, it's only at this point that Satan actually gets kind of kicked out of heaven. Where I think a lot of times we think this is, happened earlier, before kind of the events of the, of Genesis and creation. But it's really only here, and so it's not that um, Satan is like going from heaven and then get sent to earth, but that essentially Satan is being limited,
Mm.
right? His kind of realm of where he's able to work and prosper is actually being restricted here.
Yeah.
And so it's not like he's being sent to earth because God's like, well, I don't want to deal with heaven, so I'm just gonna like send him down to earth and let them deal with it. But it's more, he's just being restricted and limited more and more each time. But I think, if I remember correctly, that Michael has shown up as the protector of Israel in Hebrew scriptures already, and so
Yes.
this would have been kind of uh, not totally surprising to see, right, or to read about. But it's oftentimes gets portrayed in movies or whatever as like something that it is not. At least in my understanding of it and how I read it.
Yeah. So to me, with like drawing the connection, which we do get in this too, about the quote ancient serpent here, or the old
Yeah.
serpent, is a direct reference to the serpent in the garden, and
Hmm.
the author of Revelation is making the claim that it's the same.
Yeah.
Which, if you take Hebrew scripture on its own, does not do that. And
Yeah.
our Jewish brothers and sisters do not believe that.
Correct.
But so this is where we kind of get that idea. So it
Hmm.
doesn't come until much later in Christianity.
Yeah.
But so it draws back right to the garden with the serpent and with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which God very much is like, you don't want it. You do
Hmm.
not want that.
Nope.
But we have the tempter, the accuser
Hmm.
there. But it brings it to me always remembering, like, right, like nothing is outside of God's,
Yeah.
power. And I've said this before when we've like talked about that story a couple of times, of remembering that like God created the garden, God created the tree,
Yeah.
God created the serpent, right?
Yeah.
And so like this too is also the same, right? So if we understand that like God's powers are, that this adversary, this Satan, or this devil, as
Hmm.
we like to, properly announce it, the
Hmm.
dragon here, is
Right.
not outside
Yeah.
of the powers of God.
Absolutely. And I think the Bible Project has a really, I have found helpful video on the Chaos Serpent, Chaos Dragon, and that I recommend. Although, again, caveat that it's written from a Christian perspective, as
Mm-hmm.
all the Bible Project videos are, and so just kind of keep that, as it is. But that the Chaos Serpent, anywhere where there is kind of chaotic waters happening, this is kind of a manifestation of that. And so even in creation, by God kind of creating land is already limiting chaos serpent realm, right?
Mm.
The limiting the realm of the chaotic waters. And so this is something that shows up. We hear about a number of other earthly powers that are described as dragons or dressed as dragons. The Pharaoh in Egypt is described as a dragon, where the Pharaoh keeps harassing the people of Israel even after they've escaped. We hear that Goliath's armor is kind of looks like a serpent, has scales on it. We hear about Babylon and Persia, right? Their rulers are described as dragon-like. And so pretty much it's any force that is against God, any
Mm.
force that is chaotic, is against God, because God is a God of order that we see in Genesis, kind of, establishing this order, and making things make sense, right? But that. we are susceptible to the powers of the chaos, and we are susceptible to the powers of the dragon, where we want to kind of be in charge, and kind of think that we know best. But so yeah, you have these allusions throughout Scripture already, where you can see connections to what the serpent might be representing. Rome also gets, thrown in there every once in a while too. So. But again, even though we are susceptible to it, God is not. And when this baby that is born gets snatched, and kind of takes over heaven, I just love like the image of that king baby, on the throne. It's adorable. Its little like legs like swinging, can't touch the floor. Um, but right, that this is in the Bible Project video, it describes how Jesus kind of like the dragon slayer defeats the dragon by actually going into the dragon, right? Like being kind of going into the chaos and coming out on the other side.
Hmm.
And which I think is just a really interesting and beautiful, again, Christian perspective on all of things. But already in the garden, you're hearing about how Eve's offspring would eventually kind of stomp on the serpent, right?
Hmm.
Eventually, and so there may be kind of in this grand war, some recollection around that too.
To me, it begs a really big like question for
Yeah,
our faith, right? Of this idea of, kind of taking the whole serpent slash Satan slash devil slash dragon
yeah,
into perspective in our faith of thinking, and again talking about this with like Genesis too, but like, why did God do it?
yeah. Oh, sure, sure. I mean, sometimes
I mean, if we look to it as
I
the source of, this destruction and this chaos in our world, and that we're just continually supposed to, fight against and
right.
be bringers of justice and peace. And if this is the adversary, why did God do that?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I don't think we're going to be solving the dilemma of theodicy just here, as people have been wrestling with it for thousands and thousands of years. But I think it is still a good question to ask, right? Not necessarily that like we have all the answers, but I don't know if there's ever going to be an answer that's going to fully satisfy us, at least that we have come up with at this
Yeah.
point,
Yeah.
right? But I think, at least in some part, it's kind of a consequence of free will, right? If we're going to have a choice, God didn't want us to be like automatons that are just, like God, 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 right? um, but that if there's going to be free will, in terms of our relationship with God, and whether we are entering into this covenant or not, whether we're, receiving the gifts and keeping them, or whether rejecting the gifts that have been given to us, um, I think this is just it's a side effect that happens with that, right? Is that there's going to be um, kind of a bad side to it too.
I just personally come down on the side like I'm comfortable not knowing.
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
I come down. I think one of my favorite passages, which is another reference to Job in here, is when Job finally gets fed up and kind of goes after God, and then God
Mm.
is just like, "Where were
Oh,
you when I
oh, the
had these
clapback of all
conversations
clapbacks. Like,
of the
you
earth?
don't
Where were you?
know
Who
me.
are you to tell me?"
Yeah, seriously.
Um, and so that's where I just always like think of it
Yeah,
as like, yeah, we don't get to know. It doesn't
yeah. This
necessarily
is
make
kind
sense to me and
yeah,
how it gets laid out, but I think that there's a different sort of undergirding message here, right? That this
yeah,
this sign, this vision that he is giving to these seven churches,
yeah,
is one of hope, right? That
yeah,
like the dragon doesn't win.
yeah.
The
Oh,
dragon doesn't
absolutely.
get the baby. The
Yeah,
dragon doesn't, take over. The dragon gets cast out. That's the message to be taking, right? And so we
yeah,
have these different connections here, right? So sort of the child is born. We get this old creation and new creation kind of vision here, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit more later when we get towards the end of Revelation. That like the child is born into the old creation, into sin, and yet the child is
Mm,
taken to the throne of God, into the new creation.
yep,
Right? So we get the vision of Michael, right? That Michael's coming to the book of Daniel is, well, there's another place too, but I know the book of Daniel talks about Michael too.
yeah,
And we have, the Satan or the accuser is
hmm
finally getting put as like a formal like name being,
yeah,
because that's not a thing that had been previously been
right,
done, right? And so like that would have been a big shift for the original audience, coming from a like Jewish background perspective,
yeah,
right? So like that would have been different to put that as like an actual foe. And then making that connection to the garden of the original serpent, right?
yep. Yeah, I highly recommend another resource. This is Revelation and the End of All Things by Craig Kester, I think is how you pronounce his last name. I'm not sure if that's a reference you already have, but one that I have relied on a lot and kind of helped me understand Revelation as a whole, right? And a big picture. And so when you're talking about these seven churches, he kind of puts them into three different categories of churches that are being actively persecuted, churches that are apathetic and are kind of just resting
Hmm.
on their laurels, and churches that are trying to assimilate into the dominant culture of the time, and are kind of actively being swayed by the dragon. And so I think that we can see this revelation to these specific churches in their time and place, in their context. And I think that revelation is still relevant to us because we certainly fall into those camps. Certainly, there are more camps than that too, but a lot of times these are issues that we fall into. That the serpent is still um, actively working to oppose God and to convince us that we know best, and that we really have the power. Even the dragon slayers can kind of get pulled in and seduced by the power of the dragon. But, again, when you have Jesus in the wilderness being tempted by Satan, you have these chaos waters of the storm that Jesus calms. I think we're seeing here other examples of Jesus kind of displaying authority and power of the divine, and saying that, hey, I have control over this, and
Hmm.
this is not something that um, it's not going to be able to conquer me. It may think it's going to conquer me. It may think that it's going to take me because I'm going to die. But psst, there's the PS. We always love a good epilogue.
That's true. Well, okay, so we have so the dragon then, gets kicked out, sent to Earth. And
Yeah.
so we have this sort of like conclusion here that I think is what's, that the dragon then turns to all of the other women, the rest of the women's children, so the
Yeah.
church, of Israel and
Yeah.
stuff, that those who follow God's command, right? That you have
Yeah.
that's now the
hmm
focus. And so like if you look at this vision, right, and you get this whole remember there's the hope that the serpent doesn't win, that
Yep.
we do have this shepherd, and to keep your vigilance, right? Because
hmm
he's coming after you.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I think that one of the key pieces throughout Revelation, again, we have these seven churches that are kind of the examples, concrete examples used, but I think by and large, they also are stand-ins for kind of martyrs, the martyrs, right? The witnesses, people who are being persecuted for bearing witness to the gospel. And we see them throughout the book of Revelation, that I think that there is this constant message of don't give up, don't give in,
Hmm.
right? It may seem like this is all in vain. It may seem like the world is ending. but even in Revelation, the world ends like 17 different times.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just like, wait, is this the? No, no, just kidding. There's another, right? Uh, and I think something else that happens in Revelation is that a lot of it is, it's not chronological, because what exists in one scene,
Hmm.
then in the next scene is back again. And so it says this is not something that is based on a nice, neat timeline either, right? And so I think it
Well, it's
is,
not
again,
supposed to be, right? I think that's one of the
yeah,
things that that Christians of various kinds have extrapolated from Revelations is some sort of
yeah,
timeline that exists for when
yeah,
these things are going to take place.
yeah,
But to remember two things: this is a vision,
hmm,
not a prediction of the future or the past,
yeah,
right? And that it's meant to be a symbolic story for us to get something out of it theologically, but not
yeah,
necessarily any sort of predictor of the end times. That's
yeah.
something
Oh,
that we have put on
absolutely.
the book later.
Yep, for sure, right? And so I think it's speaking to the people in that time and place, who their world, it felt like their world was ending. I am
Hmm.
sure, from their perspective, it was. But understanding that like not all is lost, right? That there is still more to come, and it's not all in vain. So to be persistent, be of good courage,
Hmm.
um, and one of the things that I love in that final section too is when the dragon tries to kind of spew out, this river, right,
Hmm.
from its mouth. The dragon is so desperate to be God. And you just see it like over and over again, being like, "Hey, look, I've got a bunch of crowns and I have
Yeah.
diadems. I'm in charge, right?" And
I can make
it's
a
like,
flood just like
right,
God.
yeah, right. Like I can do floods too. And creation stands up to the
Yes.
right.
I know. I love that
The
part
earth
too.
swallows the river whole. And so, these waters, rivers are often signifiers of God's presence, the water that will never dry up, and, the river that gives you, eternal life, kind of a thing that we've heard about throughout, the Gospels. This is a symbol for God, God's presence, and creation is like, no.
Yeah.
I love it.
So there are like with the water spewing, the river spewing out of the mouth of the dragon, right? So there's actually
Yeah,
like direct parallels in the opposite
yeah,
that are happening here, right? So like it's in the flood story, God creates the flood to wipe out evil.
yeah,
This is the opposite, where this dragon is creating the flood to try to wipe out the good.
yep,
And then like the same thing with Exodus, right? Like the parting of the waters is supposed to be it's saving the people rather
yeah.
than destroying the people.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. And I think that's one of the great things that we see throughout Revelation is again this kind of constant twist of what people might be expecting,
Hmm.
and they think is going to happen based on their kind of limited earthly worldview. But that's the whole point of Revelation is to show you that there is more, that there
Hmm.
is an alternative. There's other stuff that is going on beyond what you may be able to kind of observe, and I think that there's this message with that again to hold on because there is more to come,
Hmm.
and that any time that seems like the end, it's not really the end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, which like so here where it sort of leaves off, right? Is that like the dragon's just kind of like
Yeah.
seething on the sidelines of the water,
Yep.
like waiting to make their next move. And that's where our story will pick up next week, where the dragon makes their next move and kind of has a
Mm,
little bit of a
mm,
shift from a
mm,
dragon into a
mm,
beast. As the
mm.
next part of John's vision, which is kind of fun. So, but to think
Yeah.
about, again, this vision of John that he's kind of laying out these very symbolically steeped stories to get to this like final conclusion of the old creation and the new
Yeah.
creation and how Christ makes the new, right?
Huh?
And so it to me it's almost like a fantasy story where kind
Mm.
of like it morphs. I think
Yeah.
about what am I trying to think of? There's something specific where it's oh uh a bad Harry Potter reference, but in the end of the Order of the Phoenix, when like Dumbledore battles Voldemort in the Ministry of Magic,
Hmm.
and Voldemort like keeps reforming and
Yeah.
keeps doing something different to try to
Yeah.
overcome Dumbledore in this battle.
Yeah.
That's kind of the way that I think about what's happening here and in the next couple of stories,
Yeah.
to kind of that same thing, but also to again that same conclusion of like they don't get a win,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I think, they're going to try everything that they possibly can to be like God,
Hmm.
to sound like God, to look like God. These beasts that get pulled out, are kind of, wolves in sheep's clothing, sort of a thing in a lot of ways, or serpents in lamb's clothing. And it's just, yeah, they are just so desperate.
It makes for a fun story though. I imagine also
Yeah.
like so if the churches that received these letters, like if they had also read some of Paul's letters, like if those had been circulated through and like
Sure.
Paul is, kind of giving some theological advice on some of these different things to do and how to be church together. And then they get
Yeah.
this letter and they're like,
Whoop.
we're reading about dragons
Yeah,
and
yeah.
what?
Yeah, I think, it's something where I love comic books, right? And as a former pre-K teacher, I love fairy tales. A big part of that is escapism, right? Because I just don't want to think about the dumpster fire reality.
Same, same.
But also there is universal truths in these stories. That's why they keep getting told.
Hmm.
Right. And so I think it's just a different way of packaging it, where we have some who are more concrete thinkers. They might be leaning more towards kind of Paul's exegetical work and,
Hmm.
all this stuff that he does. But I think apocalyptic literature has its place too. And maybe there might be some overlap, but I almost might be for another audience of people who are like me and who are like weirdos, right? Who like the Gospel of John because of all of its kind of abstract, weird language.
Hmm.
I'm drawn to that, and I think that it's helpful to read the Book of Revelation. Oddly enough, I find comfort in it because it is so weird and out there, and be like, oh, I'm not alone.
There was this one guy on an island at one point in time that was like, do
Uh-huh.
you know what I'm gonna write? I'm gonna
Yeah.
write
Mm,
a fantasy epic.
yeah. Oh, absolutely. I think it is time for another graphic novel. We haven't had a banger since like
This, yeah,
way back.
this is what the new church is missing. We don't
Yeah.
have our fantasy series in the series.
Yes.
It's a very dry library, but here we go.
Yeah.
We're gonna add more
Yeah.
to it.
Let's bring it back?
But I think one of the problems that maybe I think happened over the course of history with the interpretation of this is, some of your more, literal, straightforward thinkers that really like Paul stuff also then applied that same lens to Revelation, and we came out with some really weird theology.
Well, and I think the problem is whenever you feel like you have found the solid one right correct answer with
Yeah,
anything in Revelation, you've already fallen into the trap,
yeah.
right? I think that this is, yeah, it could sound like this, it could sound like this, but it's not meant to be a one-to-one correspondence, I
Hmm.
don't think. I mean, but I also see how people get pulled into that because it's like, ooh, like the conspiracies seem intriguing, and it just seems like this is just too much to be like a simple coincidence, right? Like it has to be referring to X, Y, or Z. Luther went through the same thing. He had a couple of people that came into town one time, and they were like big proponents of Revelation, and be like, "We cracked the code. The world's going to be ending soon," and he was like. Get the hell out of here with that mess, right? Like that is not what this is about. You're twisting all these words, kind of like fit your own thing. And then in the second preface that he ends up writing, he has done the same thing with the Pope and the Empire, right? Because he starts seeing correlations there. So I see why and how that happens. Absolutely. I confess I have fallen into that trap myself sometimes. But I think that it is, if anything, it just shows that. there are cycles in human existence as well, right? In that there are universal truths that apply really to any time and place. You could
Right.
make these things work. And so it's why I like to hold on to the universal truths of promise that we get in Revelation,
Hmm.
to kind of still hold on to, even if there's stuff that's going to come that I don't even know about yet, right? Like I can still hold on to that promise because that is something that shows up in each cycle that we see here, and I
Yeah.
think it shows up in pretty much any cycle of humanity. We can point also to, even we can say, oh, this is, the serpent, this is the mark of the beast, this is, the evil forces in the world. We can also point to the good. And we can also point to the forces that are working on the side of justice and righteousness and say, this is also universal too.
Well, that's a nice sermon, Pastor Chris. And
Bloop.
I think, no, I don't even remember what I was going to say.
Oh, sorry.
Uh, no, that is a nice sermon, and I think it helps bring into perspective and context like what the message is like trying to get across,
Yeah.
right? Then, especially when we start to like get into the numbers, right? So I
Mm-hmm.
even read something because I like to do fun things when I look at stuff like this,
Yeah.
and like read some good commentary and then read some really crappy commentary.
Sure.
Um, and someone's even talking about, right? So like it's specifically this the 1,000. Where's the? Oh, I scrolled too far on my screen.
260 days.
Yeah, right. And
Yeah.
this idea that that's like a time and a half. So it's
Yeah.
3.5 years. So it's
Yep.
exactly half of like the 7 year
Half of
like
seven. Hmm.
tribulation thing, right? That so then they like this is where they entered into this
Yeah.
period of the tribulations, right?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, so we see all over Revelation, these numbers keep showing up. 7, 10, and 12 are these really big numbers that have a lot of significance throughout Hebrew scriptures and the Gospels of being whole, complete numbers.
Hmm.
And so anytime that you get something that is half of that, wink, wink, pay attention, right? This is something that is not completed yet. Or if you get something that is like twice that, when you're talking about the 24 elders in Revelation, that's twice 12. Like that is like super complete, right? I mean,
Hmm.
this is just like beyond. When you get to the 144,000, again, that's like, it just seems like, oh, this is a very specific number of people who have been redeemed. No, you're missing the point.
Yes.
Right? Like
It's
these
12.
numbers are just
Right.
meant to be, multiples of just like super, super, super beyond what we could ever possibly imagine,
Hmm.
or something that is clearly not divine, that is not complete, that is not whole.
Yes. Which is what this is, right? So this is
Yeah.
half. This means that the story's not over yet because there has to
Yeah.
be 7 years.
Precisely.
So yeah, the numbers do they're just very interesting, right? Because like these
Yeah.
numbers do come with these symbolic meanings. And it's not necessarily like a roadmap to find the end of the world that's going to be in 3.5 years, but also
Right.
to say that there is significance if you're just like, wow, that's so weird. Why was she randomly nourished for
Yeah, I know, right?
1,260 days?
Yeah, right?
That's an awkward number,
Hmm.
right? Like that's
Yeah. Yep.
but that it's meant to be not the conclusion of the
Yeah.
story yet.
Yeah.
And as you talked about, like the symbol of the 12, right? Like most people attribute that to like the 12 apostles.
And the 12 tribes of Israel. And so when
Yeah,
you get to 24, it's kind of, I think
yeah.
there's a lot in Revelation that is trying to kind of consolidate or show that Judaism and Christianity are actually complementary and can kind of work together. I mean,
Energize the,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, exactly. And so I think that this is just another example of that when you see these kind of wild numbers. It's trying to show that like God is not done yet, right? That God is still working and that this is really for all people of all nations, of languages, tribes.
yeah,
And it's just something that, again, over and over again, it's just beyond what we could possibly imagine, or certainly beyond what we could ever do on our own, and definitely more than we could ever do with using the power of the serpent.
that's right. Well, listen, more numbers to come here in the future. We will get to the 144,000, the chosen,
Right.
and try to put some of that into perspective as people have heard. I'm sure the different things we've talked about with Jehovah's Witnesses and stuff. But
Yeah. Mm.
so next week we're gonna dive into the number of the beasts.
Less.
666. Which
Yeah.
again is short of that 7, so the
Uh-huh.
imperfection.
Hmm.
But thank you so much, Pastor Chris, for diving into our first fantasy story out
Oh,
of Revelation. And everyone, hope to have you come back next week as we dive into the numbers of the beasts.
been an
Take
honor
care,
and a
everyone.
delight.
What?
Oh, I just said it's been an honor and a delight. Thank you so much for having
Always an
me.
honor and
Yeah.
delight to have you.
Yeah.
Remember, you can always listen to the podcast wherever you find podcasts. Find us on Facebook and Instagram at 10 Football Podcasts, or go to our website, 10footballpodcast.com, and you can subscribe to our newsletter, which I don't send out very often. So if you're like, oh, I only get one of those like every 4 or 5 months, yep, that's right. But it's always with like the relevant information. So if I don't have anything relevant to say, then I don't waste your inbox. So know when you do get a newsletter from me, it's got important information in it
Special.
because it's a special one. That's why I send those out.
Yeah.
But we'll talk to y'all next week. And as a reminder that the podcast is a ministry of the Delaware Maryland Synod. To learn more, go to demdsynod.org. Take care.